The clatter of the stagecoach wheels against the hard-packed dirt road jarred Delia Gallagher's bones as she clutched her well-worn carpet bag to her chest. The faded photograph of her soon-to-be husband tucked safely between the pages of her Bible. The year was 1875, and at 22 years old, Delia had made the most daring decision of her life, traveling from Boston to the Arizona Territory to marry a man she'd never met. "Jerome's just over that ridge, miss," the driver called down, his voice barely audible over the rumble of wheels and pounding of hooves. "You'll be meetin' your fella before sundown." Delia nodded, though no one could see the gesture. She smoothed her travel-worn skirts and touched the simple bun at the nape of her neck. 6 feet tall in her stocking feet, Delia had spent a lifetime stooping, hunching, and apologizing for the space she occupied. Her mother had despaired of ever finding her a husband in Boston, where she towered over most eligible men. A woman should look up to her husband, not down at him, her mother had scolded countless times. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like Providence. "Rancher seeks bride. Must be hardy, of good character, and willing to work. Age 1830. The requirements had been simple, and Delia had responded with honesty about everything except her height. That detail she'd carefully omitted from her letters to Miles Zeller. After exchanging correspondence for 3 months, he'd sent money for her passage, and here she was, about to meet her future. The stagecoach rounded a bend, and the mining town of Jerome came into view, perched precariously on the slopes of Cleopatra Hill in the Black Hills of Yavapai County. The town looked rough-hewn and raw, buildings clinging to the hillside as if defying gravity. Copper mining had brought prosperity to the remote settlement, but as the coach drew closer, Delia could see that civilization here was a thin veneer over wilderness. "Welcome to Jerome, folks," the driver announced as the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the dusty town's main hotel. End of the line. Delia was the last passenger to descend from the coach. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped down. Even as she tried to make herself smaller, she couldn't help but stand out, not only because of her height, but because she was clearly an Easterner, from her buttoned boots to her modest bonnet. She scanned the small crowd that had gathered, looking for the man from the photograph, a solemn-faced fellow with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. Instead, her gaze was met by a short, stocky man with ruddy cheeks and a suspicious expression. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim nervously. "Miss Gallagher," he called, approaching cautiously. "Yes, I'm Delia Gallagher," she responded, forcing a smile. The man, Miles Zeller, she presumed, stopped several feet away, his eyes traveling up until they reached her face. His expression shifted from anticipation to shock, then dismay. "You didn't mention in your letters that you were. He couldn't seem to find the words. "Tall," Delia supplied, her heart sinking. Matthew swallowed hard. "Miss Gallagher, I don't mean to be unkind, but I'm afraid there's been a mistake. I can't. That is to say, a woman of your stature wouldn't suit my circumstances." The whispers began immediately. Travelers, townspeople, and the stagecoach driver all witnessed her humiliation, and Delia felt her face burn with shame. "You sent for me," she said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've traveled over 2,000 miles. Miles Zeller looked genuinely regretful but resolute. "I'll pay for your room at the hotel tonight and your return passage tomorrow. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Gallagher, but I need a wife who fits." He placed a few coins in her hand, tipped his hat, and hurried away, leaving Delia standing alone in the dusty street with her carpet bag and crushed hopes. "Well, that's a damn shame," the stagecoach driver muttered, handing down her trunk to the hotel porter. "Sorry, miss." Delia lifted her chin. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of strangers who were already whispering and staring. She had spent her life being stared at. This was merely one more indignity to bear. "The Desert Rose Hotel is right this way, madam," the porter said kindly. "Best accommodations in Jerome." As Delia turned to follow him, a commotion at the far end of the street caught her attention. A magnificent chestnut stallion came galloping into town, its rider tall in the saddle, controlling the powerful animal with easy confidence. The horseman reined in sharply, dismounting in one fluid motion beside the general store. Even from a distance, Delia could tell this man was different from the miners and shopkeepers who populated Jerome. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his days working outdoors. His dark hat shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jawline and the glint of sun-bronzed skin. "Who is that?" she asked the porter, her curiosity momentarily outweighing her distress. "That'd be Miles Zeller," the porter replied. "Matthew's cousin, owns the biggest cattle spread in these parts. The Crooked Z Ranch. Zeller, they're related." Delia was startled by the contrast between the two men. "Cousins, though you'd never know it to look at them," the porter chuckled. "Matthew runs the mercantile. Miles runs wild cattle and wilder cowboys. Come along now, miss. Let's get you settled." Delia followed the porter toward the hotel, stealing one last glance at the tall stranger. As if sensing her gaze, Miles Zeller turned, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the crowded street. Delia quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. The Desert Rose Hotel proved to be better than Delia had expected for a frontier town. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Once alone, she finally allowed herself to sit on the edge of the bed and contemplate her situation. She had exactly $12.43 to her name, not nearly enough for passage back to Boston, even if she'd wanted to return. And she didn't. There was nothing for her in Boston except her mother's disappointment and a life of spinsterhood and pitying glances. She had come west to start anew, and start anew she would with or without Matthew Zeller. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Delia quickly dabbed at her eyes and smoothed her hair before opening the door to find a young woman in a maid's uniform. "Begging your pardon, miss. I'm Sarah, and I help out here at the hotel. Mrs. Wilkins, she owns the place, sent me to ask if you'd care to join her for supper in her private parlor. She thought you might appreciate some company after your arrival." Delia was touched by the kindness. "Please thank Mrs. Wilkins and tell her I'd be delighted." An hour later, Delia found herself seated across from Ida Wilkins, a formidable widow in her 50s who had run the Desert Rose since her husband's death 10 years earlier. The private parlor behind the hotel kitchen was cozy, and the food, roast beef, potatoes, and fresh baked bread, was far better than Delia had expected. "So, my dear," Mrs. Wilkins said as she poured tea, "what will you do now?" Delia appreciated the woman's directness. "I need to find work, Mrs. Wilkins. I can't afford to return east, and truthfully I don't wish to." "And what skills do you possess?" "I'm educated. I can read, write, and do sums. I've worked as a teacher's assistant in Boston. I can sew quite well, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Wilkins nodded approvingly. "Jerome could use a proper school teacher. We've a makeshift school with nearly 30 children and Mrs. Denton teaching them all, poor woman. She's got consumption and shouldn't be working at all." Hope fluttered in Delia's chest. "You think they might hire me?" "I happen to sit on the town council," Mrs. Wilkins said with a small smile. "We meet tomorrow afternoon. I'll put your name forward." "Thank you," Delia whispered, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. "Don't thank me yet. The pay is meager and some folks might balk at hiring a woman who's been, well, rejected as a bride. People can be cruel about such things. I'm accustomed to people's cruelty, Delia said quietly. I've been too tall my entire life. Mrs. Wilkins regarded her with shrewd eyes. There's nothing wrong with being tall, my dear. The problem lies with those too small-minded to see past it. The next day dawned bright and clear. Delia dressed carefully in her best blue dress, the one she'd intended to wear for her wedding, and made her way to the general store. If she was to remain in Jerome, she would need to introduce herself properly to the town's merchants, Miles Zeller included. The bell above the door jingled as she entered the mercantile. The shop was well stocked with everything from tools to fabric, canned goods to patent medicines. Matthew was helping an elderly woman select tea, but he froze when he saw Delia. "Good morning, Mr. Zeller," she said politely, holding her head high. "I require some items for my extended stay in Jerome." Matthew's eyes widened. "Extended stay, I thought. That is, I assumed you'd be returning east." "I've decided to make my home here," Delia replied, taking satisfaction in his discomfort. "Mrs. Wilkins has kindly recommended me for the position of schoolteacher." "I see." Matthew shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I'm sure you'll find everything you need here. Martha will assist you." He gestured to a young woman arranging bolts of fabric, then hurried to the back room. Delia selected a few necessities: soap, hairpins, writing paper, and ink, then approached the counter to pay. As Martha wrapped her purchases, the bell jingled again, and Miles Zeller strode in. The tall cowboy removed his hat as he entered, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His features were rugged but handsome, with a straight nose, firm mouth, and eyes the color of a summer sky. A small scar bisected his left eyebrow, only adding to his compelling appearance. "Morning, Martha," he greeted the clerk, his voice deep and pleasant. "Matthew around?" "In the back, Mr. Zeller," Martha replied, then turned to Delia. "That'll be 65 cents, miss." As Delia counted out her coins, she was acutely aware of Miles Zeller's presence. She could feel his eyes on her, and when she glanced up, he made no attempt to hide his interest. "Don't believe we've been introduced," he said, tipping his hat to her. "Miles Zeller, madam." "Delia Gallagher," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. Standing face to face, she realized they were nearly the same height. He might have had an inch on her at most. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The mail-order bride. It wasn't a question. "Former mail-order bride," Delia corrected, lifting her chin slightly. "I've decided to remain in Jerome despite your cousin's change of heart." Miles studied her with open curiosity. "Is that so? And what will you do here, Miss Gallagher?" "I hope to secure a position as the schoolteacher." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Lucky children. They'll finally have someone who can reach the top shelf of the bookcase." Delia wasn't sure if he was mocking her or attempting humor. She chose to give him the benefit of the doubt. "Indeed. There are advantages to height, Mr. Zeller, though not everyone appreciates them." "Their loss," he said simply. Before Delia could respond, Matthew emerged from the back room, carrying a ledger. He stopped short when he saw his cousin chatting with Delia. "Miles," he said, clearly uncomfortable, "I have those supplies you ordered." "No rush, cousin," Miles replied, his eyes still on Delia. "I was just making the acquaintance of Miss Gallagher." Matthew's face reddened. "Yes, well, I'm sure Miss Gallagher is busy." "Actually," Miles said, "I was about to invite Miss Gallagher to accompany me to lunch at the hotel. That is, if she'd do me the honor." He turned to Delia with a questioning look. Delia was taken aback by the invitation. Was he merely being kind to a stranger, or did he have some other motive? Either way, The discomfort on Matthew's face made accepting the invitation decidedly appealing. "I would be delighted, Mr. Zeller," she said, gathering her purchases. Miles offered his arm, and as Delia placed her hand upon it, she couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to walk beside a man without having to look down at him. They left the store together, leaving Matthew staring after them in stunned silence. "You did that deliberately," Delia said quietly as they stepped into the sunlight. "To discomfit your cousin." Miles grinned, a flash of white teeth against sun-bronzed skin. "I won't deny I enjoy rattling Matthew's cage now and then, but my invitation was sincere, Miss Gallagher." "Why?" Delia asked bluntly. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Miles replied. "I know you traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who proved too small in more ways than one to appreciate what stood before him. And instead of crawling back east with your tail between your legs, you've decided to make your way here. That speaks to courage, Miss Gallagher, and I admire courage." Delia was speechless for a moment. No one had ever described her height as courageous before. "Besides," Miles continued as they walked toward the hotel, "it's not often I meet a woman I can look in the eye without craning my neck. It's refreshing." Delia couldn't help but laugh. "I assure you, Mr. Zeller, the novelty wears off quickly." The hotel dining room was busy with the midday meal, but Miles secured them a table by the window. As they waited for their food, Delia found herself surprisingly comfortable in the cowboy's presence. He asked thoughtful questions about her life in Boston and her journey west, listening with genuine interest to her answers. "So, the schoolteacher position," Miles said as their plates of stew and cornbread arrived. "The town council meets this afternoon to decide, I hear. Mrs. Wilkins has kindly offered to recommend me." "Ida Wilkins is a force of nature," Miles said with a chuckle. "If she's on your side, you're halfway there, but some of the council members are traditional in their thinking." "You mean they might object to hiring a woman who came west as a mail-order bride only to be rejected?" Delia asked frankly. "That, and they might question whether a proper Easterner can handle frontier children." "I can handle them," Delia said with quiet confidence. "I've always connected well with children. They don't judge as adults do." Miles studied her thoughtfully. "Would you permit me to accompany you to the council meeting? I hold some sway in this town, and my support might help your cause." Delia was touched by the offer but wary. "That's very kind, Mr. Zeller, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," he assured her. "Besides, I'm curious to see how you handle yourself. Something tells me you're more than capable of standing up for what you want." Delia smiled at the unintended pun. "Very well, Mr. Zeller. I accept your offer." That afternoon, Delia stood before the Jerome Town Council, 5 men and Mrs. Wilkins in the back room of the town hall. Miles had accompanied her as promised, and now stood at the back of the room, a silent but reassuring presence. "Miss Gallagher," said Walter Prescott, the elderly banker who served as council president, "Mrs. Wilkins has recommended you for the position of schoolteacher. Do you have any formal qualifications?" "I completed my education at the Boston Female Academy," Delia replied. "I served as a teaching assistant there for 2 years before coming west." "And why did you come west, exactly?" asked Robert Morgan, the town's only lawyer. Delia took a deep breath. "I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride." However, upon my arrival, it became clear that the arrangement would not proceed. She refused to elaborate further or show shame. "I see." Prescott exchanged glances with the other council members. "And you believe yourself suited to instruct the children of Jerome?" "I do, sir. I'm well versed in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I can also teach sewing to the girls and have some knowledge of music. More importantly, I believe every child deserves a quality education, regardless of their circumstances or background. Mrs. Wilkins nodded approvingly, but some of the men still looked skeptical. Our children can be high-spirited, Morgan said. Miners' children, ranch hands' children, not the refined young ladies and gentlemen you might be accustomed to in Boston. Mr. Morgan, Delia said firmly, children are children everywhere. They respond to clear expectations, fair treatment, and genuine interest in their well-being. I'm confident I can provide all three. Miles stepped forward then. If I might speak, gentlemen. When Prescott nodded, he continued. The Crooked Z employs 15 men with families. That's nearly a dozen children who deserve proper schooling. Miss Gallagher impresses me as a woman of intelligence, fortitude, and grace, exactly the qualities we need in a teacher. I give her my full endorsement. Delia was surprised by the passion in his voice, and the effect it seemed to have on the council members, who sat up straighter and looked at her with renewed interest. After a brief private discussion, Prescott addressed Delia again. We've agreed to offer you the position on a trial basis, Miss Gallagher. 3 months, at a salary of $30 per month. Room and board are included. There's a small cottage behind the schoolhouse for the teacher's use. If after 3 months both parties are satisfied, the position will become permanent. Relief and joy swept through Delia. Thank you, Mr. Prescott, council members. I accept and promise you won't regret your decision. As she left the town hall with Miles, Delia could hardly contain her excitement. I can't believe it. My own classroom, my own cottage. This is more than I dared hope for. Miles smiled down at her, genuine pleasure in his blue eyes. Congratulations, Miss Gallagher. Jerome just got a whole lot more interesting. I owe you thanks for your support, Delia said sincerely. Nonsense. You earned that position on your own merits. Miles hesitated, then asked, Would you allow me to show you the schoolhouse? It's not far and you might want to see your new home. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple but sturdy wooden structure with large windows and a bell tower. Behind it was a small cottage, just as Prescott had described, 2 rooms with a front porch and a water pump in the yard. It's perfect, Delia breathed, peering through the windows of the cottage. Needs some work, Miles observed. Bit of paint, some repairs to the porch steps. I could send one of my men to help or come myself if you'd prefer. Delia turned to him, suddenly curious. Why are you being so kind to me, Mr. Zeller? We only just met. Miles leaned against the porch railing, considering her question. Partly because my cousin treated you poorly, and I feel some family responsibility for that. He paused. And partly because I recognize a kindred spirit when I see one. How so? Delia asked. We're both outsiders in our own way, both tall enough to stand out in a crowd. His smile was wry. Both accustomed to being judged before we open our mouths. Delia was struck by his insight. Yes, she said softly, that's exactly it. Miles straightened and put his hat back on. I should get back to the ranch. School starts Monday morning. Yes, Mrs. Wilkins said 8 o'clock sharp. Then I'll bid you good day, Miss Gallagher, and welcome to Jerome. He tipped his hat and started toward his horse, which was tethered nearby. Mr. Zeller, Delia called after him. When he turned, she said, Thank you, truly. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes and transformed his rugged face. The pleasure was mine, Miss Gallagher. As Miles rode away, Delia watched until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Then she turned back to her new home, already planning how to make it her own. The weekend passed in a flurry of activity as Delia moved her few belongings from the hotel to the teacher's cottage. Mrs. Wilkins had spread the word about the new schoolteacher, and to Delia's surprise, several townswomen appeared at her door with housewarming gifts, curtains, a quilt, preserves, and a basket of fresh eggs. "Don't mind Matthew Zeller," said Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, as she hung curtains in Delia's bedroom window. "He's always been a fussy little man. His mother coddled him something terrible." "The children are looking forward to meeting you," added Mrs. Denton, the former teacher, a frail woman with bright eyes and a persistent cough. "I've told them you're from Boston and very learned." "And very tall," piped up Mrs. Peterson's young daughter, who had accompanied her mother. "Papa says you're tall as a pine tree." "Hush, child," Mrs. Peterson scolded, but Delia laughed. "I am quite tall," she agreed, kneeling to be at eye level with the girl. "But that just means I can reach the highest shelves without a stool, and I can see farther than most folks." "Can you see all the way to California?" the child asked, wide-eyed. "Not quite that far," Delia chuckled. "But I'll bet I can see you in the back row of the classroom without any trouble." By Sunday evening, the cottage was cozy and inviting. Delia had arranged her books on the shelves, hung her dresses in the small wardrobe, and placed her mother's silver-framed photograph on the bedside table. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, and for the first time in her life, Delia felt truly independent. Monday morning dawned clear and cool. Delia dressed carefully in a high-necked navy blue dress, professional, yet approachable, and pinned her hair in a neat chignon. She arrived at the schoolhouse an hour early to prepare, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. The classroom was basic but functional, with rows of wooden desks facing a larger desk and blackboard at the front. Shelves lined the walls, holding a modest collection of books and supplies. Delia wrote her name on the blackboard in her best handwriting, "Miss Gallagher." At precisely 8 o'clock she rang the school bell, and children began streaming in, some eager, some reluctant, all curious about their new teacher. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, boys and girls dressed in their best clothes for the occasion. And they all, without exception, stared at Delia with undisguised fascination. "Good morning," Delia said warmly once they were seated. "I'm Miss Gallagher, and I'm delighted to be your new teacher." A small boy in the front row raised his hand immediately. "Are you really from Boston?" he asked without waiting to be called on. "I am," Delia confirmed with a smile. "And you are Samuel Denton, madam. My ma was the teacher before." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Samuel. Your mother has been very helpful to me." Another hand shot up. "Is it true you came to marry Mr. Zeller at the store, but he sent you away 'cause you're too tall?" This from a freckle-faced girl of about 10. A hush fell over the classroom as all eyes fixed on Delia, awaiting her response to this impertinent question. Delia took a deep breath. She could scold the child for rudeness, deny the story, or ignore the question entirely. Instead, she chose honesty. "What's your name?" she asked the girl. "Lucy Morgan, madam." "Well, Lucy Morgan, yes, I did originally come to Jerome to marry Mr. Matthew Zeller. And yes, he decided against the marriage, partly because of my height. But that turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because now I have the privilege of being your teacher instead." The children seemed to appreciate her straightforward answer, and several nodded approvingly. "Now," Delia continued briskly, "I'd like to learn all your names, and then we'll see what you've been studying with Mrs. Denton." The morning proceeded smoothly after that. Delia assessed the children's knowledge, finding them generally eager to learn despite varying levels of preparation. By lunchtime, she had begun to match names with personalities, and had identified which students would need extra help. As the children scattered for their midday meal, some going home, others eating packed lunches in the schoolyard, Delia stepped onto the porch for a breath of fresh air. To her surprise, Miles Zeller sat on horseback at the edge of the schoolyard, watching the children play. When he saw her, He rode over and dismounted. "Miss Gallagher, how goes your first day?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Zeller. The children are wonderful, curious, and lively." "They haven't run you off yet, then?" His eyes crinkled with amusement. "It would take more than a few direct questions to intimidate me," Delia assured him. "Though I must say your cousin's rejection of me seems to be common knowledge." Miles winced. "Small town, no secrets." "I apologize if it's caused you embarrassment." "I decided not to be embarrassed," Delia said simply. "What happened is a fact, not a shame." Miles looked at her with new appreciation. "You're an unusual woman, Delia Gallagher. I've been told as much my entire life, though rarely as a compliment." It was definitely a compliment. Miles removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "I came to invite you to supper at the ranch this Saturday. Nothing formal, just a meal and perhaps a tour of the Crooked Z. As a newcomer to Jerome, you should know the area." Delia hesitated. She was attracted to Miles more than she cared to admit, but she was also wary. Her experience with Matthew had left her cautious about men's intentions. "Several of my ranch hands have children in your school," Miles added when she didn't immediately respond. "Consider it a professional courtesy." "In that case I accept," Delia said, deciding his invitation seemed genuine. "Thank you. I'll send a wagon for you at 4 o'clock Saturday." Miles replaced his hat and mounted his horse. "Good luck with the afternoon session, Miss Gallagher." As he rode away, Delia wondered what she had gotten herself into. Supper at the ranch of the most eligible bachelor in Jerome was bound to set tongues wagging. But then, people were already talking about her. What was one more topic of conversation? The rest of the week passed in a blur of lessons, names to learn, and routines to establish. By Friday afternoon, Delia felt she had made progress with most of her students, though a few of the older boys remained challenging. She was exhausted but exhilarated by her new role. Saturday dawned sunny and warm. Delia spent the morning cleaning her cottage and the afternoon preparing for her visit to the Crooked Z. She chose her green dress. The color brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, and wore her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun. At precisely 4 o'clock, a wagon pulled up in front of her cottage, driven by a weather-beaten cowboy who introduced himself as Hank, the Crooked ZTK's foreman. The drive to the ranch took nearly an hour, giving Delia time to appreciate the rugged beauty of the Arizona territory. The landscape was so different from the crowded streets of Boston, vast, wild, and breathtakingly beautiful in its harshness. The Crooked Z Ranch sprawled across a valley, with mountains rising in the distance. The main house was larger than Delia had expected, a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. Surrounding it were various outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. Miles was waiting on the porch as the wagon approached. He had exchanged his work clothes for clean dark trousers and a white shirt, though he still wore his boots and gun belt, a necessary accessory in the territory. Delia had learned. "Welcome to the Crooked Z, Miss Gallagher," he said, helping her down from the wagon with strong, sure hands. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," Delia assured him. "The scenery is magnificent." "It grows on you," Miles agreed, offering his arm. "Let me show you around before supper." The tour was fascinating. Miles showed her the barn, the blacksmith's forge, and the corrals where young colts frolicked alongside their mothers. He spoke with obvious pride about the ranch he had built from nearly nothing over the past decade. "My father left me 100 acres and 50 head of cattle when he died," Miles explained as they walked. "The rest I've added bit by bit, good years and bad, drought and flood, Apaches and rustlers. It hasn't been easy, but it's mine." "You've accomplished a great deal," Delia said, genuinely impressed. How many acres now? Just over 2,000 with 800 head of cattle, Miles said. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but respectable. As they returned to the main house, Delia noticed a small grave marker beneath a mesquite tree in the yard. Miles followed her gaze and his expression sobered. My wife, Eleanor, he said quietly, and our son. They died in childbed 4 years ago. Delia's heart constricted. I'm so sorry, Miles. I didn't know you were widowed. Few people in Jerome remember. We married in Tucson and she was only here a year before. He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. But that's in the past. Shall we go inside? Mrs. Gunderson, my housekeeper, has been cooking all day. The interior of the ranch house was comfortable rather than luxurious. The furniture was solid and well made, the floors covered with colorful Navajo rugs. What surprised Delia most were the bookshelves and shelves of them in the study Miles showed her. You're a raider, she said, running her fingers along the spines. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father, Miles explained. She believed education was the greatest gift she could give me, even out here in the wilderness. These were her books originally. I've added to the collection over the years. Delia pulled out a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. This was my father's favorite poet. Was? Miles asked gently. He died when I was 12. Influenza. Miles nodded in understanding. It seems we've both known loss. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Gunderson, a plump, rosy-cheeked woman who announced that supper was ready. The meal was simple but delicious: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Throughout the evening, Delia found herself increasingly drawn to Miles. He was intelligent and well-spoken, with a dry wit that made her laugh. Yet there was a solidity to him, a groundedness that she found immensely appealing after the superficial young men she had known in Boston. After supper, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The air was cooling rapidly, and Miles draped a blanket around Delia's shoulders. You miss Boston? He asked as the first stars began to appear. Delia considered the question. I miss certain things: the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of the city. But I don't miss feeling like a curiosity everywhere I went. I don't miss my mother's constant worry that I would never marry because of my height. Your height is magnificent, Miles said quietly. You shouldn't have to apologize for it. Delia turned to look at him, startled by the conviction in his voice. Most men find it intimidating. Most men are fools, Miles replied simply, my cousin chief among them. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. I should take you back to town, Miles said eventually, though he sounded reluctant. It's getting late and you have church in the morning, I expect. Yes, Delia agreed, equally reluctant to end the evening. Thank you for your hospitality, Miles. I've enjoyed myself tremendously. Instead of calling for Hank to bring the wagon, Miles harnessed his own buggy, a smart two-seater with a fringe canopy. The drive back to Jerome seemed shorter somehow, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. At her cottage, Miles helped her down from the buggy and walked her to the door. In the silvery moonlight, his features were shadowed, his eyes bright. Good night, Delia, he said, his voice low. May I call on you again? I'd like that, she replied honestly. Miles hesitated, then lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. Until then. As his buggy disappeared into the night, Delia stood on her porch, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, wondering if she was being foolish to hope that Miles Zeller might see in her what his cousin had not. The following weeks fell into a pleasant rhythm. Delia taught during the day, finding increasing satisfaction in her students' progress. Evenings and weekends, she corrected assignments, prepared lessons, and gradually made friends among the women of Jerome. Miles called regularly, sometimes just stopping by her cottage for a brief conversation on his way to or from town, other times inviting her for buggy rides or picnics in the hills. Their friendship deepened, and Delia found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and alarmed her. One Saturday in late October, Miles invited her to accompany him to a harvest dance at the town hall. "Nothing fancy," he assured her. "Just music, dancing, and a potluck supper." "I'd love to attend," Delia said, "but I'm not sure I should go as your companion, Miles. People will talk." "People already talk," he pointed out with a grin. "Might as well give them something worthwhile to discuss." The night of the dance, Delia wore her best dress, a russet-colored silk that she'd brought from Boston, hoping to wear it for special occasions with her new husband. The irony wasn't lost on her as Miles knocked on her door, dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders. His eyes widened appreciatively when she answered. "You look beautiful, Delia." "Thank you," she said, suddenly shy. "So do you." "That is, you look very handsome." Miles laughed, the sound warming her. "I clean up reasonably well for a cowboy. Shall we?" The town hall was festooned with autumn leaves and lit by dozens of lanterns. A small band played lively tunes, and the dance floor was already crowded with couples when Delia and Miles arrived. Their entrance caused a stir. Miles was well respected in Jerome, and Delia had gradually won acceptance as the town's teacher, but seeing them together matched in height and striking in appearance provoked whispers and curious glances. Miles Zeller was there with Martha from his store, now wearing his ring. He nodded stiffly when he saw them but made no move to approach. "Would you like to dance?" Miles asked, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were attracting. "I'd love to," Delia replied, deciding to follow his lead and ignore the onlookers. Miles proved to be an excellent dancer, leading her through waltzes and reels with easy confidence. Delia, who had always felt awkward and conspicuous on the dance floor in Boston, found herself enjoying the sensation of being perfectly matched with her partner. "You're smiling," Miles observed during a waltz. "It suits you." "I'm happy," Delia admitted. "I never expected to be happy in Jerome, but I am." "Because of the teaching?" Miles asked, his eyes intent on hers. Delia hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Partly, and partly because of you." Miles' hand tightened slightly on her waist. "I'm glad to hear it." As the evening progressed, other townspeople approached them, chatting easily with Delia now that Miles had so clearly signaled his approval. Even Matthew eventually made his way over, Martha at his side. "Cousin," Matthew greeted Miles stiffly. "Miss Gallagher, Mr. Zeller," Delia replied politely. "Miss Clark, or is it Mrs. Zeller now?" "Not yet," Martha said with a shy smile. "Next month." "Congratulations," Delia said and meant it. She felt no resentment toward the young woman. "Thank you," Matthew mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. "You seem to be settling in well in Jerome." "Very well," Delia agreed. "The children are a delight to teach." An awkward silence fell, broken when Miles said, "If you'll excuse us, I believe they're playing our song." He guided Delia back to the dance floor, his hand warm against the small of her back. "That was painless," Delia observed as they began to dance. "Matthew's not a bad sort," Miles said. "Just narrow in his thinking." "Martha suits him. She's sweet and agreeable and exactly the height he thinks a woman should be." "And what height do you think a woman should be?" "Miles Zeller," Delia asked, emboldened by the warmth in his eyes. Miles smiled slowly. "I think she should be exactly tall enough to fit perfectly in my arms when we dance," he said, drawing her a fraction closer. "Just like you do." Delia's breath caught at the open admiration in his gaze. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an oddity or an inconvenience because of her height. She felt beautiful. The dance ended too soon, and Miles suggested they step outside for some air. The night was chilly, stars brilliant in the clear sky above Jerome. They walked a little away from the town hall, finding a quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree. "Delia," Miles began, his voice serious, "these past weeks have been the happiest I've known in a very long time." "For me as well," she said softly. "I need to be clear about my intentions," he continued. "I'm not a young man. I'm 35 years old, a widower with responsibilities and a past that sometimes haunts me. But I find myself thinking of the future again, and that future includes you if you'll have me." Delia's heart pounded. Are you proposing, Miles?" "Not yet," he said, taking her hands in his. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. We're still getting to know each other, but I am asking for the right to court you properly, with marriage as our mutual understanding." Relief and joy flooded through Delia. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Miles' smile was radiant in the moonlight. "May I kiss you, Delia Gallagher?" "Yes," she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand, but as Delia responded, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a connection, a beginning. When they finally parted, Miles rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Delia asked, her hands resting lightly on his chest. "I didn't want you to think I was like all the others, seeing only your height, either as a novelty or a deterrent. I wanted you to know I see you, Delia, all of you." Tears pricked at Delia's eyes. No one had ever understood so completely what it was to be always judged, always measured before being known. "Thank you," she whispered. They returned to the dance hand in hand, and this time Delia didn't mind the stares or whispers. Let them talk. Let them see. For once in her life, she was exactly where and with whom she was meant to be. The courtship of Delia Gallagher and Miles Zeller became the talk of Jerome through the fall and into winter. Miles called at her cottage regularly, bringing small gifts, books, wildflowers, once a kitten from a litter born in his barn, and taking her on excursions throughout the area. They rode into the hills, visited neighboring towns, and spent quiet evenings by her fireplace, reading aloud to each other or simply talking. In December, Miles invited Delia to spend Christmas at the Crooked Z. Mrs. Gunderson goes to her daughter's in Prescott for the holiday, so it will just be us and Hank, who has nowhere else to go. I understand if you'd prefer to remain in town." "I'd love to come," Delia assured him. "Christmas at the ranch sounds wonderful." The Crooked Z was transformed for the holiday. Miles and his men had cut a pine tree from the mountains and set it up in the main room, decorated with paper ornaments, strings of popcorn, and a few precious glass baubles that had belonged to Miles' mother. Holly and evergreen boughs adorned the mantelpiece, and candles glowed in every window. Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire after a simple but delicious supper, listening to Hank play carols on his fiddle. When the old cowboy finally retired to the bunkhouse, Miles reached for a small package beneath the tree. "I'd like you to open this tonight," he said, placing it in Delia's hands. The box was wrapped in brown paper tied with red ribbon. Inside, Delia found a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty. "It was my mother's," Miles explained. I hoped we might put our pictures in it someday, if you'll marry me, Delia." Joy bloomed in Delia's chest, so intense it was almost painful. Are you asking me now? Miles knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. I am. I love you, Delia Gallagher. I love your intelligence and your kindness, your courage and your grace. I love the way you've made a place for yourself in Jerome through sheer determination. I love that you see past my rough edges to the man I strive to be. He paused, his blue eyes earnest. And yes, I love that you're tall enough to look me in the eye when I tell you these things. Will you be my wife? Tears spilled down Delia's cheeks. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Miles, I'll marry you. He rose and pulled her to her feet, enfolding her in his arms. You fit perfectly, he murmured against her hair. As if you were made for me. Perhaps I was, Delia whispered back, and then his mouth found hers, and words became unnecessary. They were married on New Year's Day, 1876, in the Jerome church with the entire town in attendance. Even Matthew and his new bride, Martha, came, offering awkward but seemingly genuine congratulations. I owe you an apology, Miss Gallagher, Mrs. Zeller, Matthew said stiffly at the reception. I behaved poorly when you arrived. I'm glad things have worked out for the best. So am I, Delia replied sincerely. She felt no resentment toward the man who had rejected her, only gratitude that his actions had led her to Miles. Their honeymoon was a week in Tucson, where Miles had business interests and where they could enjoy the amenities of a larger city before returning to ranch life. The journey was Delia's first real adventure in Arizona beyond Jerome, and she reveled in the new sights and experiences. In Tucson, they stayed at the finest hotel, attended the theater, and dined in restaurants where Miles proudly introduced Delia as his wife. They also purchased furniture and household items for the ranch house, which would now be Delia's home. What about my teaching position? Delia asked one evening as they discussed their future. I've grown to love it, and I'd hate to abandon the children mid-year. Miles considered this. It's a long drive from the ranch to town every day, but we could manage it until the end of the school term in May. After that, perhaps we could start a small school at the ranch for our Hands children. There are enough of them now to warrant it. Delia was touched by his willingness to accommodate her wishes. You wouldn't mind having a working wife, Miles laughed. Delia, every wife in the territory is a working wife. Whether it's teaching or running a household or both, there's no room for idleness out here. When they returned to Jerome and the Crooked Z, Delia found that Miles had renovated part of the house in her absence, adding bookshelves to their bedroom, setting up a small study where she could prepare her lessons, and building a covered walkway from the main house to the well so she wouldn't have to wade through snow or mud to fetch water. You've thought of everything, Delia marveled as he showed her the improvements. I want you to be happy here, Miles said simply. This is your home now. Life as Mrs. Miles Zeller was busy, challenging, and deeply satisfying. Delia continued teaching in Jerome until the end of the school year, making the daily journey with Miles or Hank. In the evenings, she embraced her role as mistress of the Crooked Z, learning from Mrs. Gunderson about managing the household and adapting Boston recipes to frontier ingredients. Weekends were devoted to exploring the ranch with Miles. He taught her to ride astride rather than side-saddle, a scandalous but practical concession to ranch life, and showed her all the hidden corners of the Crooked Z. The spring-fed pool where he swam in summer, the cave where he'd sheltered during a blizzard his first winter, the ridge where wildflowers carpeted the ground each spring. Their physical relationship deepened along with their emotional bond. Delia had been raised with the proper Boston girl's education about marital duties, minimal, euphemistic, and focused on endurance rather than pleasure. Miles, with patience and tenderness, showed her how wrong those teachings had been. In his arms, Delia discovered passion and joy she had never imagined possible. "You're so beautiful," he would murmur as they lay together in the darkness. "Every inch of you." And Delia, who had spent a lifetime being too tall, too angular, too much, finally felt exactly right. Spring brought new life to the crooked Z calves in the pastures, foals in the corrals, and the news that Delia was expecting their first child. "Are you happy?" she asked Miles when she told him, suddenly uncertain. Given his past loss, she wasn't sure how he would receive the news. His response was to lift her off her feet and spin her in a circle, his face alight with joy. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said, setting her down gently. "But also terrified. We'll take every precaution, Delia. The best doctor, whatever you need." "I'm strong and healthy," she assured him. "And Dr. Wilson in town is quite competent. Everything will be fine." Miles placed a protective hand on her still flat abdomen. "This child is blessed already, to have you for a mother." As promised, once the school year ended, Miles helped Delia establish a small school at the Crooked Z for the ranch hand's children. They converted an unused storage building into a classroom, complete with desks, books, and a blackboard. 8 children attended that first summer, ranging from 5 to 14 years old. Their parents, grateful for the opportunity, often expressed their thanks with gifts of preserves, handcrafted items, or offers to help around the ranch house. "You've transformed this place," Miles observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Delia was 5 months along, her pregnancy beginning to show. The Crooked Z was just a working ranch before. Now it's a home, a community. "We've transformed it together," Delia corrected, leaning against his shoulder. "I never imagined such happiness, Miles, not even in my wildest dreams." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Nor I after Alina died. I thought that part of my life was over. Thank God I was wrong." The baby, a boy they named David after Delia's father, arrived in November, healthy and strong with a lusty cry, and his father's blue eyes. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated, and when it was over, Dr. Wilson pronounced both mother and child in excellent condition. "You have a fine son, Zeller," the doctor said as he prepared to leave, "and a remarkable wife." Miles, who had paced outside the bedroom throughout the 12-hour labor, looked from his son's tiny face to Delia's tired but radiant one with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "I know," he said simply. "Believe me, I know." That night, after the doctor and Mrs. Gunderson had gone and the ranch was quiet, Miles lay beside Delia on their bed, little David sleeping between them. "I was so afraid," he admitted, his voice low. "When I heard you cry out in pain, all I could think about was Alina and how I'd found her too late to say goodbye." Delia reached across their son to touch Miles' face. "But everything turned out differently this time. We're both here, safe and well." Miles caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you, standing there in the street outside the Mercantile, looking like you wanted to disappear even as you held your head high?" "What?" Delia asked, curious. "I thought, there's a woman who would never fit into anyone's idea of what she should be, and thank God for that." Miles smiled at the memory. "You were magnificent, Delia. You still are. Even sweaty and exhausted after 12 hours of labor," she teased. "Especially then," he said seriously. "You've given me back my future, Delia. You and this little one." As if sensing he was the topic of conversation, baby David stirred and opened his eyes, gazing up at his parents with unfocused curiosity. "Hello, son," Miles whispered. "Welcome to the Crooked Z. Your mama and I have been waiting for you." Delia watched as Miles gently traced their son's tiny features with one finger, and her heart swelled with love for both of them. How strange and wonderful life was, she thought. If Matthew Zeller had not rejected her for being too tall, she would never have found Miles, never known this perfect happiness. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "That sometimes the things we think are our greatest misfortunes turn out to be our greatest blessings," Delia replied. "Being too tall brought me to you." Miles smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "And being too tall means you fit perfectly in my arms," he reminded her. "Just as I knew you would from the moment I saw you." In the years that followed, the Crooked Z prospered and grew, as did the Zeller family. David was joined by a sister, Eleanor, named for Miles' first wife, and later by twins Thomas and James. The ranch school expanded to include children from neighboring spreads, with Delia hiring an assistant teacher as the enrollment increased. Matthew and Martha Zeller eventually moved to Phoenix, where Matthew opened a larger store and did well for himself. They visited occasionally, their relationship with Miles and Delia cordial if never especially warm. Matthew and Martha had 3 daughters, all petite like their mother. Delia maintained correspondence with her own mother, who finally visited the Crooked Z when David was 5. Mrs. Gallagher, initially skeptical about her daughter's frontier life, was won over by the obvious happiness Delia had found and the clear adoration Miles showed for his tall wife. "I worried so about you," Mrs. Gallagher confessed during her visit. "I always thought your height would be an impediment to finding a suitable husband." "It was," Delia said with a smile, "until I found the right one." As the children grew, the Crooked Z became known not just for its fine cattle and horses, but for the warmth of its hospitality and the strength of its family bonds. Delia and Miles worked side by side, partners in all things, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Miles surprised Delia with a trip to Boston, their first journey east since their marriage. They visited her childhood home, attended the symphony, and showed their children the city where their mother had grown up. "You ever regret it?" Miles asked one evening as they strolled along the Boston Common. "Leaving all this for the wilds of Arizona." Delia looked around at the elegant buildings and well-dressed people, then back at Miles, still handsome at 55, though his dark hair was now liberally streaked with silver. "Not for a moment," she said truthfully. "I found my place in the world at the Crooked Z. I found myself in your arms." Miles pulled her close, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by still startled, even in 1896, by the sight of a couple matched in height, clearly deeply in love after 2 decades together. "And you still fit perfectly," he murmured against her hair. "Just as I always said you would." As they walked back to their hotel, arm in arm beneath the gas lamps of Boston, Delia reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a mail-order bride rejected for being too tall to a beloved wife, mother, teacher, and rancher's partner. It had been a life filled with challenges, joy, sorrow, and above all, love. And it had all begun with a rejection that turned out to be the greatest blessing of her life.